I never thought a single voicemail from my son would be the thing that kept me from losing everything I'd spent 40 years building. But that's exactly what happened on a Tuesday morning last February, when my phone lit up with a message that started with 3 words, I'll never forget. Dad, stop everything. Let me back up. My name is Robert Calloway. I'm 64 years old. I spent 38 years as a structural engineer with the city of Portland, Oregon, designing bridges and overpasses, calculating load tolerances, and stress points for a living. I was good at seeing where things would break before they broke. In concrete and steel, anyway. When it came to my own life, I had the worst blind spots of any man I've ever known. My wife passed 4 years ago. Her name was Carol, and she died on a Saturday morning in March from a heart attack that none of us saw coming. She was 59 years old, fit, healthy, the kind of woman who walked 5 miles every morning and knew every neighbor on our block by name. The doctors said her arteries had been narrowing for years without symptoms. She went to bed on Friday night and never woke up. Our son was a junior in high school when it happened. He was 16, and he took it harder than either of us, led on to each other. He went quiet in the way that teenagers go quiet, not dramatically, not with crying or outbursts, but with a kind of careful stillness that was somehow worse. He finished his senior year, got into Oregon State for mechanical engineering, and left for Corvallis that fall. I stood in the driveway watching his car pull away and felt the house close in around me like something alive. For the first 2 years after Carol died, I managed. That's the only honest word for it. I managed. I cooked badly, slept too little, and filled the hours with work even after I'd retired. I volunteered at a local technical college teaching drafting to students who'd never held a pencil over a blueprint. I went to my son's games when he played intramural soccer and sat in the bleachers eating bad hot dogs, pretending that was enough. It wasn't enough. My neighbor's wife introduced me to the idea of online dating, the way people introduce you to things they're half embarrassed about quickly, with a shrug, as if it didn't matter whether you did it or not. She said a friend of hers had met someone wonderful. She said I seemed lonely. She wasn't wrong, so I made a profile on one of those sites for people over 50. I put up a photo my son had taken at Thanksgiving. I described myself as recently widowed, retired, interested in hiking and woodworking. I pressed submit and felt immediately ridiculous. That's where I met Diana. Her profile said she was 56, a former pharmaceutical sales manager who'd taken early retirement after her divorce 3 years prior. She had grown children who lived out of state. She liked farmers markets and road trips and had recently gotten into watercolor painting. She looked warm in her photos, bright eyes, easy smile, the kind of woman who seemed comfortable in her own skin. We messaged for 2 weeks before meeting for coffee at a cafe in the Pearl District. She was already there when I arrived, sitting by the window with a flat white and a book. And she stood up when she saw me and extended her hand and said it was so nice to finally meet me in person, and something in my chest that had been clenched tight for 4 years loosened just slightly. We dated for 8 months before I asked her to move in. My son was away at school. The house had 4 bedrooms and a yard. Carol had spent 20 years filling with garden beds. It seemed senseless for me to rattle around in it alone. Diana was gracious about it. She said she didn't want to overstep, that she understood the house had history, that we should move at whatever pace felt right to me. I told her it felt right. I meant it. What I didn't notice, or didn't let myself notice, was how my son responded when I told him. He was home for winter break when I sat him down and explained that Diana would be moving in after the new year. He listened without interrupting, which was characteristic of him. He'd been that way since he was a child, the kind of kid who processed things internally before he spoke. When I finished, he asked a few careful questions. How long had we been together? Whether I'd spoken to a lawyer? Whether I felt sure? I told him 8 months no and yes, in that order. He nodded slowly. He said he was glad I wasn't alone. He went back to his room, and I told myself that was a good enough reaction from a 20-year-old who'd lost his mother. I should have paid more attention to what he wasn't saying. Diana moved in with 2 carloads of boxes, and the ease of someone who had done this before, which I supposed she had, given her previous marriage. She rearranged a few things in the kitchen, added some of her own art to the walls, planted lavender in the side garden. She was considerate about Carol's photographs and never suggested I take them down. She made dinners on the nights she wasn't at her watercolor class. She introduced herself to the neighbors. She was, by every measure I thought to use, a good and reasonable presence in my home. About 6 months after she moved in, she started talking about a fresh start. She brought it up gently, over dinner, the way she did most things. She said she'd been thinking. The house was beautiful. She knew how much it meant to me, but sometimes she felt like she was living in someone else's life. She wanted a place that was ours, she said. Something we'd chosen together. She'd been looking at properties on the coast, smaller, newer, a clean slate. I told her I needed time to think about it. She said, of course. She understood completely. 3 weeks later, she mentioned that a couple she knew had bought a place near Cannon Beach and were already talking about what an investment it was. A week after that, she left a real estate listing open on the kitchen counter with a handwritten note that said, "What do you think?" The property was listed at $890,000, which would be manageable if I sold the Portland house and pulled from the investments Carol and I had spent decades building together. I thought about it. I told myself I was being practical. The Portland house had appreciated significantly. I could sell it, walk away with a substantial amount, buy the coast property outright, and still have enough to live on comfortably. It made a certain kind of financial sense if you accepted the premise that I wanted to start over. And I had started to accept that premise, slowly. The way you accept things when someone is very patient and very warm and very consistent in the story they're telling you about your future together. I called a real estate agent in October. I told my son about it over the phone. There was a pause on his end that lasted long enough for me to ask if he was still there. He said he was still there. He said he had some concerns. I asked what kind of concerns. He said he'd rather talk about it in person. I told him I appreciated that, but the market timing was good, and I didn't want to delay. I said Diana and I had thought this through carefully. I asked him to trust me. Another pause. Then, "Okay, Dad, I hear you." That was in October. The listing went live in November. We had an offer within 2 weeks, a young family, all cash, asking price. The closing was scheduled for December 15th. Diana was visibly excited. She started boxing up things she said we wouldn't need, organizing what would go into storage while we waited for the coast property to clear. She talked about the new place the way people talk about a dream they've been holding for a long time, with a specificity that should have struck me as strange. On December 4th, 11 days before closing, I was getting ready to drive to the title company for a preliminary meeting when my phone buzzed with a voicemail notification. My son. I almost didn't listen to it right then. I was running a few minutes behind and Diana was waiting in the car. But something made me play it. His voice on the recording was controlled, the way it gets when he's working hard to stay calm. "Dad, I need you to stop everything. Don't go to any meetings today. Don't sign anything. Call me as soon as you can. I'm driving up from Corvallis right now. I'll be there by noon. I found something about Diana and I need you to see it before you do anything else. Please, just wait for me." I stood in the hallway with my coat half on and listened to it 3 times. Diana honked from the driveway. I went to the door and told her I wasn't feeling well. I said I thought I might be coming down with something and asked if she could call the title company and reschedule for later in the week. She looked at me for a moment with an expression I couldn't quite read, then softened into concern and said, "Of course," and came inside and offered to make me tea. And I sat at the kitchen table drinking tea I didn't want and watching her move around the kitchen and trying to keep my face completely neutral. I have never worked so hard at anything in my life. My son arrived at 12:15. Diana was in the back of the house doing something with boxes. I met him at the front door and he came in quickly and we went straight to my office and I closed the door. He looked exhausted. He'd driven 2 hours and his jaw was tight in a way I recognized from when he was a teenager processing something he didn't know how to say. "Talk to me," I said. He pulled out his laptop. 3 weeks earlier, he told me, he'd been doing a search on Diana not out of hostility, he said carefully, just because he'd been uneasy and hadn't been able to shake it. He'd started with basic things, her name in connection with the places she'd mentioned, her career history, the pharmaceutical company she said she'd worked for. The company existed, but her name didn't appear anywhere in connection with it. Not in old press releases, not in LinkedIn history, not in industry directories that list sales representatives by region. He broadened his search. He found a woman named Diana Marsh, which was the last name she used with me, mentioned in a 3-year-old court filing from Clark County, Washington, a civil case. A man named Gerald Hofstede had filed a lawsuit alleging fraud and intentional misrepresentation in connection with the sale of a shared property. The case had been dismissed because Gerald Hofstede had signed everything voluntarily. But the filing was detailed, and the story it told was almost identical to ours. He showed me the document on his screen. I read it twice. A widower, a relationship that moved quickly, conversations about fresh starts and new properties. Her name added to a shared account described as necessary for estate planning. A property sold, and the proceeds directed into a joint account. And then Diana Marsh, gone. Gerald Hofstede had not recovered his money. He was 71 years old and living in a rental in Vancouver, Washington. I put the laptop down on my desk and sat very still. "There's more," my son said. He had also found a mention in a background database he'd accessed through his university's research library, a records aggregator used by investigators and journalists. The name Diana Marsh appeared linked to 2 other names in the system, Karen Petroff and Diane Mallory. All 3 names were associated with the same physical description, the same approximate age, and a cluster of civil filings in 3 different states over 8 years. None of the cases had resulted in criminal charges. Every single transaction had been legal on paper because every single mark had signed willingly. I thought about the estate documents Diana had asked me to update 6 months ago. My lawyer had gone through them with me and had been professionally neutral about the changes, but I remembered now that he'd paused on one page longer than the others and asked me to confirm I understood what joint tenancy with right of survivorship meant in practical terms. I had confirmed it. I had been in a hurry that day. Diana had a dental appointment, and I'd scheduled the lawyer meeting too close to it. I asked my son how certain he was about what he'd found. He said he wasn't certain about everything. He said it was possible there was an innocent explanation. He said he just needed me to see it before December 15th. I looked at my son for a long moment. He was 20 years old. He was sitting in the office where he used to do his homework in middle school, where his mother used to bring him hot chocolate during winter break, and he had driven 2 hours on a Tuesday morning because he was afraid for me. I thought about October. I thought about the pause on the phone. I thought about all the things I decided not to hear. "You tried to tell me?" I said. He looked at his hands. I didn't have anything concrete then. I just had a feeling. "You asked me if I'd spoken to a lawyer. About the moving in." "Yeah, that was you trying to tell me." He didn't answer, which was answer enough. I asked him to stay in the office. I went into the kitchen where Diana was making a second pot of coffee, and I told her that my son and I needed to go over some family paperwork for a few hours, financial things from his mother's estate that had come up. I apologized for the timing. She was gracious. She said she'd go to her watercolor class and give us space. She kissed my cheek, got her bag, and left. When her car pulled out of the driveway, I went back to my office and sat down across from my son. I was a structural engineer for 38 years. I know that when you discover a flaw in a load-bearing element, you do not panic. You do not start ripping things apart. You assess. You document. You bring in the right experts. And you build a plan. "We need help," I told my son. "But not the police. Not yet." He asked who. I told him about Frank Delgado. Frank had been my project supervisor for the first 15 years of my career. He'd retired from the city a decade before I did and gone into private consulting, the kind of work that exists in the space between what's legal and what's findable. He found structural defects in buildings that owners were trying to quietly sell. He located assets that had been moved around to avoid audits. He was not exactly an investigator, but he knew everyone who was. We'd had lunch every few months for 30 years until Carol died, and I'd let most of my routines collapse. I called Frank from my office landline because I still had his number memorized from the days before cell phones made memory unnecessary. He picked up on the third ring with his usual opener. "Calloway, you still alive?" I told him I needed a favor. A real one. He said, name it. I told him about Diana, about the lawsuit filing my son had found, about the names. I told him I needed to know who she actually was, and whether the pattern my son had identified was real, and I needed to know it in 72 hours, because I had a closing in 11 days. Frank was quiet for a moment. Then he said, give me 48, and don't sign anything. My son stayed the night. We didn't talk much about Diana directly. We talked about other things. His coursework, a project he was working on, whether I'd gotten the furnace serviced. We made pasta for dinner. He slept in his old room, and I lay awake in mine and listened to the house breathe around me. Diana came home around 9. I heard her moving through the kitchen, heard her come to the bedroom door, heard her pause. I kept my breathing even. She went back down the hall. At 3 in the morning, I heard her on her phone, her voice low and quick, a cadence I hadn't heard from her before. I couldn't make out words. I lay still and stared at the ceiling until her voice stopped. The next morning, she was cheerful and ordinary. She made scrambled eggs. She asked my son about school with what sounded like genuine interest. She asked me how I was feeling, whether the stomach trouble had passed. I told her I was better. I ate eggs I could barely taste and smiled across the table at a woman I was no longer sure I knew at all. Frank called at 6 o'clock on Thursday evening. Sit down, he said. Diana Marsh was not her real name. Her legal name was Karen Susan Petrov. She was 54, not 56. She had a prior marriage in Nevada that had ended not in divorce, but in an annulment under circumstances that Frank's contact described as murky. She had lived under at least 3 different identities across Oregon, Washington, and California over the past 9 years. The Clark County lawsuit my son had found was the only one that had made it into civil court, but Frank's contacts had located 2 other men who had been defrauded and never pursued legal remedies. One because he was too ashamed, and one because by the time he realized what had happened, the statute of limitations had complicated things. There was also a man named Victor. Frank didn't have a last name yet, but he had a phone number that appeared repeatedly in Karen Petrov's call records from a carrier account she'd apparently left open under a secondary name. Victor appeared to be in contact with her multiple times a week. Frank suspected he was coordinating the financial exit. He had a profile consistent with someone who handled the receiving end of these transfers. She targeted you specifically, Frank said. There's a dating profile database my guy accessed. She had 2 accounts running simultaneously on the site where you met her. Yours was the only one she responded to after she found your public county assessor record. She looked up the property value before she ever messaged you. I sat in my car in the driveway with the engine off and the phone pressed to my ear and felt something I hadn't felt since I was a young engineer and a section of a retaining wall I'd designed failed during a rainstorm. That particular failure hadn't hurt anyone, but I'd stood in the rain looking at the rubble and understood for the first time in my career what it meant to be wrong about something with real consequences. This was worse. What do I do? I asked. Frank said he had a plan, but I wasn't going to like part of it. His plan was this. I should not cancel the closing. Canceling would tip her off, and she'd vanish before there was any way to catch her in an actionable fraud. Instead, I should let the closing proceed, but work with my attorney to ensure that the sale proceeds went into a monitored escrow account, held solely in my name, structured in a way that would look to Diana like a joint account being set up. When she attempted to access or redirect the funds, which she would, that attempt would constitute provable fraud. Meanwhile, Frank's contacts would locate Victor and build out the full picture of the operation. If we could document the coordination between them, her attempt to access the money, his position on the receiving end, we'd have conspiracy to commit fraud, which was a felony charge that would be significantly harder to dismiss than the civil complaints that had failed her previous victims. The risk, Frank said carefully, is that you have to keep living normally with her for 11 more days. I asked if there was a shorter version. There's always a shorter version. You confront her, she runs, and she's in Mexico by Friday. Your call. I told him I'd do it his way. The next 11 days were the strangest of my life, which is saying something given that I'd already spent 4 years learning to live without my wife. I sat across from Diana at dinner and talked about paint colors for the Cannon Beach property. I walked through the house with her as she talked about what to donate and what to keep. I nodded and made notes and did not let my face do anything my face wanted to do. My son was back in Corvallis. We texted daily. He had found Gerald Hofstede, the man from the Clark County, filing through a public records search, and had called him. Gerald had spoken with him for almost an hour. He told my son that by the time he understood what had happened, he had been too humiliated to go to the police. He said he wished someone had caught her. He said he was glad my son had found what he found. My son told me, Gerald cried on the phone. I thought about Gerald Hofstede often during those 11 days. I thought about the other men Frank had found. I thought about how Karen Petrov moved through these lives, leaving nothing behind that looked like a crime because she was careful, and because the men she chose were careful not to look too closely at their own vulnerability. She had understood something about grief and loneliness that most people spend their whole lives hoping no one uses against them. She had certainly understood it about me. My attorney, a sharp woman named Patricia, who had handled our estate planning since Carol and I were in our 40s, was not surprised when I came to her with all of it. She said she had not felt comfortable with the joint tenancy changes, but that it wasn't her place to override a client's clearly stated wishes. She said she was glad I was here now. She set up the monitored account with the kind of quiet efficiency that told me she had handled complicated situations before, without making anyone feel foolish for needing her. When she tries to move the money, Patricia said, "We'll have it in real time. I'll be on call that entire day." The closing happened on December 15th, as scheduled. I sat across the table from the buyers, a young couple with a toddler they'd brought to the signing, who kept grabbing at the pens, and I signed the papers for the house where my son had grown up, where Carol had died, where I had lived for 22 years. Diana sat beside me and held my hand when the notary wasn't watching, and I let her. And I did not think about what her hand felt like because I needed to get through the day. The proceeds cleared into the monitored account at 4:47 that afternoon. At 6:12, Patricia called me. She tried to initiate a wire transfer. $840,000 to an account in the Cayman Islands. The hold flagged it. We've documented everything. I'm sending the file to the DA's office tonight. I was standing in the kitchen of the rental property we'd moved into temporarily, a furnished place in northeast Portland that Diana had found and that I now understood she had found because it had a back exit and was close to the airport. Diana was in the bedroom. I could hear her moving around. "Thank you," I told Patricia. I put my phone in my pocket and stood in the kitchen for a minute. I thought about the young couple who'd bought my house. I thought about that toddler grabbing at the pens. I thought about Carol's garden that I'd left mostly intact when we moved out because I hadn't been able to bring myself to dig it up, and the new owners had said they'd keep it, and I had believed them. Then I walked to the bedroom doorway. Diana was at the dresser. Her phone was in her hand, and she was staring at it with an expression I had never seen on her face, tight, focused, stripped of the warmth she wore like a second skin. She looked up when I appeared in the doorway, and the warmth came back so quickly it was like watching someone put on a coat. "Hey," she said. "Are you hungry? I was thinking we could order in tonight, celebrate a little." "Sure," I said. "But first I want to talk to you about the account." Something shifted behind her eyes. Just for a second. Just a flicker of recalculation. "What about it?" I told her that my attorney had flagged an unusual activity. A large wire transfer attempt that had been blocked. I said Patricia had called me to verify whether I'd authorized it. Diana's expression moved through three things in about 2 seconds: surprise, recovery, and then a version of concern so practiced it was almost impressive. "That's so strange. I wonder if it was some kind of error. I didn't initiate anything. Do you want me to call the bank?" I told her that wouldn't be necessary. I told her I'd already spoken with Patricia, and that Patricia had the documentation, and that we also had her call records from 3 nights ago, and that a man named Frank Delgado had spent the past week building a fairly comprehensive picture of Karen Susan Petrov and her associate Victor, and that Gerald Hofstede in Vancouver had been willing to speak with investigators, and that the 2 other men Frank had located were being contacted as well. The warmth was completely gone now. What replaced it was something I can only describe as stillness. Not the stillness of someone who's been caught off guard, but the stillness of someone who is running through options very quickly and finding fewer of them than expected. "You've been planning this," she said. "So have you," I said. "For considerably longer." She looked at me. Her face was very different than I had ever seen it. Harder, older somehow, the softness she'd worn for 18 months, simply absent. I thought of those retaining walls. How much a structure can hold before what you see on the surface tells you nothing about what's happening beneath it. "You're not as slow as you seem," she said finally. "I'm a structural engineer," I told her. "I've spent 40 years finding failure points before they fail." The front door opened then. Because my son was there, he'd driven back up from Corvallis that afternoon and been waiting in his car down the street. He came in quietly, the way I'd asked him to, and stood behind me in the hallway without saying anything. Frank was outside. Patricia had already sent the documentation. A detective from Portland PD, who had been Frank's contact, was parked at the corner. Diana looked from me to my son and back to me. "There are 2 ways this goes," I told her. "The same 2 ways there always are." She chose the third option, which was to try for the back door. And she would have made it if Frank hadn't been faster than a man his age had any right to be. She was arrested that evening. Victor, whose full name turned out to be Victor Crane, was apprehended at PDX trying to board a flight to Panama City. He had operated as the financial coordinator for at least 4 similar operations over 7 years. He cooperated almost immediately. He gave up details that Karen Petrov would not have given up herself: account numbers, previous targets, the specific timeline of how she had identified me as a viable mark, and how long she had been watching before she sent that first message. I had been researched for 6 weeks before she contacted me. She had reviewed the public assessor records, estimated the property value, identified my retirement from the city, confirmed that I was widowed, and determined that I had 1 child, adult, living away from home. She had constructed Diana Marsh specifically for me. The watercolor painting, the love of farmers markets, the easy warmth, all of it had been calibrated. Learning that was, strangely, not the worst part. The worst part was understanding that none of it would have worked if I hadn't needed it to. Victor's cooperation led to a federal fraud charge on top of the state charges. Karen Petrov was convicted 11 months later. 7 victims testified, including Gerald Hofstede, who drove up from Vancouver, Washington, and sat in that courtroom in a suit that looked like he'd bought it for the occasion, and spoke for 8 minutes about what it meant to be 68 years old and rebuilding from almost nothing. I sat 2 rows behind him and listened to every word. She was sentenced to 9 years. Victor got 4, with eligibility for early release, contingent on continued cooperation with the federal investigation into the broader network they'd been part of. The house sale was voided through a legal process that Patricia navigated with the same quiet efficiency she brought to everything. The buyers were understandably frustrated, and I was deeply sorry for the disruption to their plans. We eventually negotiated a settlement that was fair to them and allowed me to reclaim the property. I moved back in January, into the house I'd been ready to leave, and stood in Carol's garden in the cold and thought that some things you shouldn't walk away from just because someone convinces you the walking is necessary. My son came home for a long weekend in February, the 1-year mark from the voicemail. We didn't make anything formal of it. We made chili, the way Carol used to make it with cornbread on the side, and ate at the kitchen table. He told me about a project he was working on for his senior thesis. I told him about a mentorship program I'd signed up for at the technical college, working with students who wanted to go into civil engineering. At some point, he asked me if I was angry. I thought about it. "Not the way I expected to be," I said. "I'm angrier at myself than at her." He shook his head. "She was a professional, Dad. It's literally what she did every day for years. I dismissed your concerns in October. I didn't give you anything concrete in October. You asked if I'd spoken to a lawyer. When she moved in," he looked at his chili. "I should have asked why you were asking," I said. "I knew why you were asking. I just didn't want to." He let that sit for a moment, the way he lets things sit. He's 21 now, and he's going to be one of those people who thinks before he speaks his entire life. And his mother would have been enormously proud of that. "Do you think you'll try again?" he asked. "Dating, I mean." I told him I didn't know. I told him I thought the problem wasn't dating. The problem was that I'd gone looking for a replacement for something I couldn't replace, and I'd been so focused on filling the space that I'd let someone walk into it without looking at who they actually were. Mom wasn't replaceable, my son said carefully. No, I said, but being alone isn't the worst thing either. I'm learning that. Frank and I have lunch every month now, back to the routine I'd let collapse after Carol died. He doesn't talk much about the case. He's not the kind of man who requires credit, but he showed up to the sentencing and sat in the back, and after it was over, he shook my hand and said, "Your kid's good, Calloway. Whatever you did right with him, you did it right." I thought about that for a long time. Gerald Hofstede and I have stayed in contact. We email occasionally. He's moved into a smaller place near his daughter, and he's doing what he calls fine, which I understand to mean something specific and partial and enough. He told me once that the hardest part wasn't the money. The hardest part was the time afterward, when he second-guessed every memory, every moment he'd believed was genuine, trying to separate what was real from what had been performed for him. I understood that. I spent months doing the same thing. But here is what I eventually concluded, and what I would tell Gerald if I thought he was ready to hear it. The longing was real. The need for connection was real. Those things didn't become fraudulent just because someone exploited them. Karen Petrov didn't invent my loneliness. She just knew how to find it and what to offer it. That's the con, ultimately. Not the paperwork or the account numbers or the legal technicalities. The con is finding the thing you most need and becoming it long enough to take everything else. And the counter to it, the thing my son did, the thing Frank did, the thing Patricia did, wasn't cynicism. It wasn't suspicion as a default or a refusal to trust. It was paying attention. It was asking the question instead of staying comfortable. It was my son sitting with a bad feeling for 3 weeks and then acting on it instead of talking himself out of it the way I would have. He called it a voicemail. What it actually was my son choosing me, choosing to risk the awkwardness, risk my dismissal, risk being wrong, because the alternative was worse. Carol used to say that love was a verb. She said people used it as a noun because nouns were easier. You could point to them and say, there it is. But love was a thing you did or you didn't do every day in the choices you made about who got your attention and your honesty and your effort. My son did a lot of verb that December. I live in the house on the same street I've lived on for 22 years. My son's room is still his room, even though he's in Corvallis 9 months of the year. Carol's garden came back this spring. The lavender and the black-eyed Susans and the climbing roses she spent 5 years training up the back fence. I don't know what the new owners would have done with it. I'm glad I don't have to find out. I volunteer on Tuesday afternoons and Saturday mornings. I have lunch with Frank. I text my son daily and call him on Sundays and actually listen instead of waiting for my turn to talk. I'm not the same as I was before. But I've stopped thinking that different is necessarily worse. Last month, one of the other victims from the trial called me a man named James from Sacramento, one of the ones who'd stayed silent for years. He'd seen a news piece about the sentencing. He said he'd wanted to come forward a long time ago but hadn't known how. He said talking to me had helped him decide to finally tell people what had happened. His daughter didn't know. He was going to tell her. I told him his daughter would be glad he did. I told him it was hard to let someone see where you'd been foolish. He said it was harder to carry it alone. He was right. The men Karen Petrov targeted were counting on that, on our shame, doing her work for her, long after she was gone. She picked people who would be too proud to admit what had happened, too embarrassed to call it by its name. I'm 64 years old. I've made mistakes that cost me more than I want to think about. But I have a son who drove 2 hours on a Tuesday to stand in my office and show me what he'd found, knowing I might not receive it well. I have a friend who spent 48 hours calling in favors on my behalf, without being asked twice. I have an attorney who noticed something was wrong before I did and stayed professional enough to wait until I came around. That's not a small thing. That's the whole thing, actually. If you're watching this, and you're somewhere in the middle of a story that feels like mine, if there's someone in your life trying to tell you something you don't want to hear, or if you're the one trying to find the right words to reach someone who's stopped listening, I want you to know something. The text matters. The voicemail matters. The question asked carefully over the kitchen table matters. even if it gets dismissed the first time, even if it takes 3 weeks, even if the person you love isn't ready yet. Say it anyway. Do the verb. And if you're a father like me, who almost missed it, be grateful for the people who wouldn't let you. Where are you watching this from? And what time is it there? Because wherever you are, I hope you have someone in your corner who would make that call. The one that starts, "Dad, stop everything. I found something." Those might be the most important words I've ever heard.